Sylvia Rohr Samaniego, and I'm the director of the University Art Gallery, or the UAG, at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 8th installment of Turning Points. Our focus today is the conservation of time-based media and the special challenges and opportunities it offers for museum practice. Our guests today are Tina Rivers-Ryan, Editor-in-Chief of Artforum, and Deena Engel, Clinical Professor Emerita of the Department of Computer Science at the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York University. This conversation will be moderated by Vuk Vukovic. Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion. Before I hand this over to our guests for the conversation, I would like to say a few words about the moderator and the co-organizer of this event, Vuk Vukovic. Vuk is a PhD candidate in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture and Film and Media Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. His dissertation examines the exhibition of time-based media, video art history, and has a particular emphasis on the work of Nam June Paik. Since August 2023, Vuk has been the Graduate Fellow in the University Art Gallery, where among his many responsibilities and accomplishments, he has led a special project focused on a cyberkinetic work in our collection by the artist Wen-Ying Tsai. Vuk's incredible and dedicated research has advanced our understanding of Tsai's work and has laid the groundwork for future conservation and exhibition projects around time-based media. His pop-up exhibition, Reigniting the Spark, the Conservation of Wen-Ying Tsai's Cybernetics, was the impetus for this event today. Thank you, Vuk, for your invaluable work in the gallery and in the department, and thank you for the work you have done to convene us here today. With that, I hand it over to you and to our guests.
Thank you so much for spending the next hour with us. Time is, as we all know, precious. And in fact, it is the passing of time that really is fundamental to the discussion we're going to have today. We all know that paintings and sculptures get old. They get dusty, sometimes they fall apart, and there are thousands of professionals devoted to trying to slow down their aging process. There are, by contrast, many fewer experts in preserving time-based media, which is one of the reasons why we're so privileged to have our speakers today. Before I introduce our guests, I wanted to share a brief reflection on the event we presented at the UAG yesterday. The pop-up exhibit featured ephemera on the cybernetic work by Wen-Ying Tsai, a Chinese-American artist who combined art and technology to create his works. By emphasizing the time-based media component of the work and the dire need to conserve it, this event will build on the conversations we had yesterday and provide answers on different ways of conserving time-based media art. We have asked our speakers to share with us a case study that addresses their turning points in the field of time-based media and its conservation. Tina Rivers-Ryan is a curator, author, editor, and art historian. Ryan's expertise is in new media, which includes digital and internet art. Ryan was a curator at the Albert Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York since 2017. In 2024, Ryan was named the editor-in-chief of Artforum. Her 2016 dissertation, McLuhan's Bulbs, Light Art and the Dawn of New Media, lays the foundation on understanding the history of new media art and digital technology as we understand it today. In tracing the history of the Howard Wise Gallery, Ryan captures more broadly the significance of the gallery as a site of fluidity of art and technology, a legacy that continues to impact emerging media such as NFT and AI, a new digital frontier Ryan pioneers through her practice. And now that I've said that, I'll hand the presentation over to Tina.
Muted. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much, Vuk, for that introduction. And thank you so much to the UAG for hosting this conversation today. I have been a fan of the work of Wen-Ying Tsai for a really long time. I actually wrote about Tsai's work and his exhibition at the Howard Wise Gallery called Cybernetics back in my doctoral dissertation, and have unfortunately not had the opportunity to put on view the sculptures by Wen-Ying Tsai that are in the collection of the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. But it's certainly work that I've been interested in, and regret that I'm not there in Pittsburgh to see the work in person, but really glad to be part of this program around that. So I was asked, as Vuk said, to speak about a turning point in my career and my thinking about time-based media art conservation. And I want to preface this by saying that I feel somewhat sheepish because I'm sharing the stage here with Deena Engel, who's so legendary in this field. And I myself am not a conservator and have a very different relationship to this topic. So I'm going to just sort of speak very quickly about my relationship to time-based media art conservation as a curator and the lessons that I learned, which are probably quite obvious to anybody who is a conservator who has worked with this material, but I was asked to speak about my personal turning point, and so this is my awakening. All right, without further ado, let me go ahead and share my notes here. So I will be, so just as sort of a preface, again, I began being interested in media art as an art historian, was invited by NYU to speak about the history of time-based media, which then put me into conversation with the folks at the Conservation Center, which then led to me coming back and speaking again as part of the launching of the Conservation Center's concentration on the conservation of time-based media art. So I had been thinking about these things as an art historian in a kind of academic way, but really for me, what was more significant was when I began to actually work with the material as a curator and not just as an art historian. So I had read articles like Pip Lawrenson's Authenticity, Change, and Loss in the Conservation of Time-Based Media Installations, which for me was really a turning point because it helped me begin to understand that in conservation of media artworks, you're talking about fundamentally ontological questions about what the work of art actually is, and ethical questions about what it means to try to preserve these works. And, you know, is there a point at which actually they can or perhaps should no longer be conserved? And I got to put that all in practice with an exhibition that I assisted on, Introducing Tony Conrad, a retrospective, which was a major survey, a retrospective survey of the work of Tony Conrad, who is a pioneering media artist who lived here in Buffalo for many decades. He's a faculty member at the University of Buffalo. This is an exhibition that was curated by Kathleen Chaffee, our chief curator, with my assistants. And so I just wanted to point out the very many strategies that we had to take and the questions that we had to consider while preparing this exhibition. So you see here on the screen, Tony's video cycles of threes and sevens from 1977. And so this video, we very deliberately chose to present on a Dotronix monitor on a pedestal as a kind of compromise that would allow people to understand the historical specificity of these black and white tapes from the 70s that would have been screened originally on Cube 4:3 format black and white televisions. And I say compromise because, you know, we're not literally showing it on an old television. It is on, you know, a pedestal, et cetera. So it's about sort of figuring out a way to somehow remain authentic to the integrity of the work and the artist's vision and how it historically would have been viewed while not making it a kind of fetishized antique kind of object. The next work, and I'm just sort of briefly going to show you just a, you know, half a dozen highlights really quickly. Tiding Over Till Tomorrow. So this was actually a work that's in the museum's collection, permanent collection. It was originally a 35 millimeter slide carousel performance. And so this raises really interesting questions about not only how is this work digitized, but also, you know, how do we capture some of the liveness, the piano performance that's part of this, et cetera. So, you know, again, this fundamental question about what is actually the work, and it's been decided, you know, by the artist representatives, by the artist, by the gallery, by the museum, that digitizing this work is not a step too far, that it does not need to still be shown on a slide carousel. And yet you can see that the format of the digital projection attempts to preserve something of the dimensions of a kind of slide carousel presentation. we're thinking not only about the ontology of the work itself, like what the work actually is, but also about the phenomenology of the visitor experience. So how is it, as I mentioned in the very beginning with the first slide of cycles of 3s and 7s, how is it that this work would have been encountered originally? And so this is a moment in the exhibition where we showed a series of videotapes on these Dotronix cubes on low pedestals with seating in front of them to sort of replicate the kind of almost more domestic environment that you might have been in watching these tapes that often circulated through these kinds of networks, right? Where people had personal access to them. And we included one particular tape retrospective, Authorized to Surrender, that Tony himself curated as in sort of two formats. So one of them was as the original 6-hour runtime where Tony edited these tapes to run sequentially in a particular sequence, and we wanted to preserve that. But then we also come up against the reality of the limitations of showing work in a white-walled context, and very few people are actually going to sit down for 6 hours and watch something end to end. So we also made that same program available through an interactive kind of jukebox interface that allowed people to manually select for themselves which of those titles they wanted to watch in any order. But we tried to have it both ways, right? To have Tony's original curated 6-hour sort of program and also this interactive version. One of the major things I learned while working on this exhibition was the importance of documentation. And frankly, the paucity of documentation of especially historical time-based media artworks. So I'm showing you here on the screen Panopticon, which is a work that Tony actually showed at this same museum, at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum back in 1988, and was considered lost. And we knew it from photos that were published in the Buffalo News, small, grainy, black and white photos. But based on that, we were able to traipse through the attic of one of the storage spaces of Tony's here in Buffalo. This was after he had passed. And we literally went through, like rifling through, looking for these pieces. And we were actually able to find the cardboard units here and pick them essentially what felt like out of the trash and to revive this installation. So we had the tapes, but what we didn't have was the rest of the materials. And so something, I think we have to think about a lot, especially as more and more people do media art installations, is to think about how the physical elements are preserved and documented alongside the media assets. Again, the importance of documentation. This work, Quartet from 2008, is an amplified wooden swing, essentially. And one of the fundamental questions we had was, how loud is this thing supposed to be, right? So having the diagrams to install it, having the components, having the materials list was not really sufficient in order to be able to show this work appropriately, because it really is about volume. And we didn't know, we had a hunch based on the kind of artist Tony is, but we didn't know definitively how loud should this thing really be. So, the importance of qualitative narratives as well as quantitative data in attempting to sort of reconstruct for the future generations the experience of the work is really, really important. Speaking of documentation, we actually included a lot of documentation in the exhibition, and something we have to think about a lot when including documentation, especially, media documentation alongside media art, is how do we distinguish for our viewers the difference between a work of video art and a video that's on a screen that is not art, but is documentation? And so I don't know that that's a challenge that we, totally solved for, but, or a problem we totally solved for. But you can see here, for example, that this documentation is presented on a 16:9 flat screen, and as opposed to the historical video material that was on a 4:3 monitor. So you get a sense of the sort of, the recentness of this, and it visually, I think, just sets it apart a little bit from the other work. So that was I probably went over my allotted time, and I hate to take any more time away from Deena, but that was my brief tour through the Tony Conrad show. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to talk about it more afterwards. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Deena. That was fabulous. I can't wait for our discussion. Moving forward with Deena's presentation. Deena Engel is a clinical professor emerita of the Department of Computer Science at the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York University. Her research focuses on the conservation of digital-born and software-based art. Her work on restoring software-based art, such as Net Flag by Mark Napier, Unfolding Object by John F. Simon Jr., and Brandon by Sua Leah Chang, are a few examples of conserving and making the works accessible to a new group of museum visitors. Engel is also the co-director, along Professor Glenn Wharton, of the Artist Archive Initiative, and she also works with major museums on projects which address the challenges involved in the conservation of time-based media art. And now that I've said that, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Deena.
One moment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I want to thank you, Vuk and Sylvia, for having me. So, after working for 10 years at Sotheby's in the systems group as a programmer and also a project manager, I managed databases and systems like the collection management system and the custom software for producing those then beautifully printed catalogs. I joined the computer science department faculty at the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences to teach undergraduate computer science. I taught web development, I still teach database courses and programming to undergraduates, and a series of digital humanities classes for undergraduate computer science students and for graduate students in the humanities. And then one day in 2008, I got a call from Glenn Wharton, who was at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, working as a conservator with time-based media art. Apparently, he and Jim Coddington, who was director of conservation at MoMA at that time, had called the director of the Courant Institute to say they were starting to receive floppy disks and hard disks and cables and all kinds of computer items. And what should they do? And the director of Courant at the time said, "Oh, you want to talk about art? Go talk to Deena." And so Glenn and I decided to collaborate. I had lots of undergraduate students looking for research opportunities in computer science, but very few opportunities to do technical research in a cultural heritage field. And Glenn had a lot of software-based artworks in his care that needed to be studied. Among the early works that we studied, 33 Questions Per Minute by Raffaello Zeno-Hammer is a work of text art that could run in one of three languages, English, Spanish, or German, depending. Sorry, should I go back?
No, that's fine, Deena. Thank you for turning on the camera. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, no, I'm glad you told me. 33 Questions Per Minute by Raffaello Zeno-Hammer is a work of text art that could run in one of three languages, English, Spanish, or German, depending on how the software was configured, and used custom hardware as well. John Maida's Mirror Mirror is one of the reactive book series, and we looked at all 5 works in the series that ran on standard hardware, but it was considered old even then. And Phil Worthington's Shadow Monsters, which is a play on the Victorian shadow puppets using video and computation to create monsters out of the shapes of the museum visitors' hands. Well, of course, I've seen the system struggle with processing demands. So in all of these cases, and this was back, 2008, 9, 2010, we conducted source code analysis where the source code was available, documented the hardware configurations and any custom hardware, as well as the additional software libraries that were used, such as the special software for shadow monsters, the so-called physics libraries, to make the hair springy and fall naturally, and another software library used to produce the shadow monsters' loud burp and giggle sounds. So Glenn and I often spoke about how to set up fruitful collaborations, as museums and universities both have mandates to educate, but different missions. We looked at artworks together and with other staff at MoMA to determine the research needs at that time for MoMA's collection and time-based media art generally, especially software-based art. And I worked with the computer science department to be sure that the projects we're establishing were meeting the important academic criteria, like requiring research experience and writing results to a professional standard and public speaking experience. So we completed over a dozen studies during those 4 or 5 years while Glenn was at MoMA. And then I next collaborated with Joanna Phillips starting around 2013, bringing computer science students into the conservation lab at the Guggenheim Museum for another 5 years or so, and conducting research as well with Joanna and her staff on the Guggenheim collection. I also brought students and collaborated with Christian Paul at the Whitney Museum of American Art and with the Dia Foundation. And in all of these cases, we examined the source code for the software-based artworks, the real code that the programmers wrote, whether it was the artist programmer or whether they were working with the programmer just like a sculptor may work with others. We examined the hardware where it was available. We looked at the artworks from the point of view of computer scientists to bring this technical knowledge into the art world for the curators and conservators whom we worked with. The students' research reports were all given to the respective museums for their artwork files. And then outside of that, many of these projects led to further research for me and my curatorial and conservation colleagues, publications and talks, and additional research. At the Guggenheim, we had the opportunity to restore 3 of the museum's iconic webworks, where I co-directed from the technology aspect. Brandon by Shuli Chang, about the tragic story of Brandon Teena. Unfolding Object, a generative artwork that supports user interaction by John F. Simon Jr., and Net Flag by Mark Napier, an artwork that encourages people to create flags from many symbols and a fixed color vocabulary inspired after the events of 9/11. During this time, Glenn Wharton and I established the Artist Archives Initiative, a very different approach to digital humanities to study contemporary art, where we balanced the research on the curatorial and conservation aspects of the artworks with technology research on how to best design digital storage for the resulting data and information. We focused on 2 New York City artists, David Wojnarowicz and Joan Jonas. David Wojnarowicz, an artist who worked across many media and was the subject of a Whitney retrospective in 2018, and with Joan Jonas, who's still with us wonderfully, a pioneering performance artist, currently the subject of a retrospective at MoMA. The David Wojnarowicz knowledge base uses a wiki to leverage a more traditional database solution called SQL, which is structured query language, but in a way that we could accommodate the many relationships among the objects in his oeuvre and support the conservation research that was going on. We used linked open data for the Joan Jonas project, and descriptions of the technology research are included alongside the historical narratives for each artist, along with tutorials linked to the open data Joan Jonas project. And I'm delighted to say that after a great deal of work on the part of lots of gracious contributors, and of course my co-editor, Joanna Phillips, who is now the Director of Conservation in the city of Düsseldorf, Germany, our book, The Conservation of Time-Based Media Art, came out in the late fall 2022. We hope it will serve the community well.
Amazing. That was so great, Deena. Thank you so much. I am just so in awe of both Deena and your presentation, Deena, as well. I think it's really interesting how your actual practical work on it contributes to the scholarship as well and informs it as it's getting written as well. So to start off with our questions, which I have a few already, on my mind that I want to ask, that I also draw from your presentations that were very rich, from images, but also from the things you've said. So to start off with, the first question that I have is, I'm kind of interested to hear each of you reflect on the title of our event. How do you interpret aging futures in the context of time-based media art and its conservation?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, computer-based art and software-based art, especially all of time-based media art, it is so fragile. With computer-based art and software-based art, the slightest change in operating system upgrades, software upgrades, hardware changes can render the artworks no longer functioning. And it may even be something that's out of the control of the conservators, or the curators. I was working on a project where an IT department in a museum, for very good reason, decided to switch their internet protocol from HTTP to HTTPS, a very reasonable technical decision made for, and when they ran the artworks, they thought everything looked okay, but of course everything wasn't okay. Conservators had to be called, and we were able to fix it. But they're so fragile, and it's not always clear just how fragile they are. So that's what comes to my mind about aging futures. And with software and computer-based art, it could even be weeks or months, not even years, that we need to work around.
I mean, there's so much important work that has been done by so many, museums and organizations on dealing with the fragility that Deena mentioned, and I, want to highlight in particular Rhizome, which has really been, doing so much work, really important work to think about, questions of documentation, as I mentioned, about what does it mean to really document a work, and through the various other projects, thinking also about not just documenting the work, but the entire environment, right? Especially for born digital files, or things that are internet based that might be dependent on that have these externalities, like they're dependent upon some type of real-time information coming through the internet, or that are about a particular piece of software operating within a particular environment, right? So how do you document and capture all of that, and how do you emulate it, and to what degree, like how do we even know how far we should go with all of these sort of extreme measures? And so yeah, I mean, I'm not doing that work myself, but I very much look towards people like Deena or like Rhizome that are having those conversations and thinking those things. I will answer this question about how I understand the concept of aging futures as a curator. I just actually was asked this question yesterday about what it means, like basically the question was, well, a Michelangelo can make his art, and then 200 or 500 years later, we can still look at it. But with this digital art stuff, what's going to happen in 200 years? Can people look at it? And I think that question is really a question inside a question, right? So on one level, people are asking about it on, in terms of logistics, in terms of the materiality of the work, in terms of the technology, like how do you keep this work alive? But I think what people are really asking, and they just either don't know that they're asking it or are afraid to say it, is, will this work still be relevant in 200 or 500 years if it is so dependent upon particular technologies that themselves will obsolesce, right? We have this idea that like paper doesn't obsolesce, marble doesn't obsolesce, so ergo works made in those media are still relevant, but something that, like a work of art, like Cory Arcangel's work that's like a bot, trolling Twitter, now X, like, will that still be relevant to people in 500 years? And I'm a bit of a contrarian naturally, but I think also, I just have a lot of passion for this material, and I do believe that digital art, that there are some examples that will be sort of transcendent and timeless, and not all of it, but not all of painting is transcendent or timeless either. And so the way that I think about it now, and this is what I said yesterday, and I'll repeat it today, one of my favorite paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art is Hans Memling's Annunciation. which is a painting of the angel Gabriel coming in to announce to the Virgin Mary that she's going to become pregnant with the Son of God. To be totally clear, I am not a Catholic, and I'm not a Western European, and I'm not from the Middle Ages. So I do not culturally belong in any way, right, to the world of this painting. And in fact, I only have access to it. Like, I only understand that the lily represents Mary because I read the wall label, right? So I think what I'm trying to say here in my own elliptical way is that we have this idea that certain works of art are quote unquote timeless, just because culturally we value them. But the reality is that they actually are quite historically specific, are very much of their moment. And it's just that we've decided that the moment that they belong to is also valuable and is worth teaching people about. And so if, now 500 years later, I have to do the work of reading the label to understand something about Christian theology, 500 years from now, why don't people read a label to learn something about Twitter so they understand the work of Cory Archangel? Like, I just don't think that we're asking too much of our audiences, right? That it's actually the curator's job, it's the museum's job to provide the kind of historical background, including, comments about the technology, the tools, the culture, in order to make sure that people understand the relevance of that work into the future. And that it's not, in some sense, it's very different from, say, a work by Michelangelo, but in other ways it's not. So maybe not so aging is what I'm trying to say. Or maybe the role of the curator is to revivify, to make zombie art.
And I was going to add that it's so fascinating because in the computer software industry, nobody really cares about old software. I mean, if the ATM machine runs, that's fine. If you upgrade it, well, whatever. It doesn't matter how the ATM machine ran before, as long as it still knows, how much money you have in your account, right? So there's really only a handful of fields, including one field in applied math called computational reproducibility, which is all about, yes, you need to be able to reproduce the kinds of computations that happen for science research 500 years from now. But otherwise, there's a very different focus. So I kind of love the fact the way the two fields look at this so very differently and have so much to learn from each other.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you. I also want to make sure to let our audience know to use the Q&A option. If you have any questions for our speakers, please feel to type it in. And so happens we already have one already. So I'm going to make sure that our audience's voices are being heard as well. So the first question is from Alex Taylor, and their question is, given Tsai's work as the context for today's event, I wondered if the speakers have thoughts about time-based media art that also has its own sculptural form and the ethics of showing that work if it is not fully operating. Is it still the complete work if it is not doing everything it can do? How should we make this clear to audiences? Great question.
I think it's much more of a curatorial question than a computer science question.
It is a great question. Thank you, Alex. Hi, Alex. So there's, as a curator, there's two different ways that we approach this question, right? One is, or sort of we have to divide it in two, I think. One is for when we're looking retrospectively at works that have already been accessioned into a collection where the artist maybe has already passed away. And we're talking about retroactively trying to come up with a solution that's appropriate. And then the other question, the other field is dealing proactively with new acquisitions, right? And so how are we going to get ahead of this problem? So when we're dealing with, sorry, I just realized I had my directions reversed maybe for your perspective on Zoom. So sort of retroactively dealing with this question, right? Of how do we deal with something that's defunct? I mean, I think we've seen this. The solution that we've seen is that basically you make a little mini exhibition where you present the object on display, but you surround it with interpretive material, with didactics, with archival documentation, and you talk about what it was you know, and the sort of how it broke and what the process of conserving it has been. And so I mean, I think I've been really fascinated by the number of recent exhibitions that have really highlighted the conservation process. A couple of years ago, I was in Washington at the National Gallery of Art, and they had a big show that was entirely about the conservation of one of the Pollock paintings. And, you know, I also have seen now various museums, it wasn't at the Rijksmuseum, I think, that did this, where they actually are having the conservation work happen live in front of an audience. So sort of like, you know, an animal in a zoo. And I don't know if the conservators always love this, I'm not sure, but, you know, the idea that you sort of make a public demonstration out of it, right? That it's a teachable moment. That said, you know, you're really not able to capture the aesthetics of the object, and you are framing it as first and foremost an archival object, and only secondarily as an aesthetic object, or an object that offers aesthetic experience, right? So it's almost like putting a kind of filter bubble, right, around the original sort of force of the object as an artwork. That said, and I've talked a lot to my colleagues, you know, who are also like me, digging around in the muck of art history and fascinated by these analog electromechanical sculptures from the 60s and 70s that basically now are, you know, lying in pieces in cardboard boxes in museum basements. You know, is that better than nothing? Or what would it look like to try to, you know, get the funds together and the teams together to bring those works back to life? And you know, it's a big hurdle because it is very resource intensive. And I have a lot of admiration for the museums that have taken it on, but usually it is a kind of like with the Psy, like it's a focused project. You know, you just sort of do one artwork at a time to give you the chance to do the deep research and, you know, even just the research of, you know, interviewing the artists' heirs and estates, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of like moving forward, I try now to always have the conversation with any artist who works with any kind of media or any kind of technology. I ask them, you know, at what point should we consider this defunct? And once we reach that point, what are the ways in which you would want us to present it to the public, right? So would you want us to just simply leave it in our warehouse and it is not to be ever shown publicly and will only be available to, you know, art history PhD students who are writing a dissertation for private viewing? Would you want us to show footage of it, right? Would that be an acceptable substitute once the original is no longer, you know, presentable? What should that footage look like? Who would make that footage? I just had a conversation last week with an artist. You know, they were saying, well, you can show documentation once it dies. I said, okay, great. But like, are we making that documentation or are you? Because if we're making it, then we're going to make some choices. And you know, how long should that documentation run? Should it be a 5-minute video, a 30-minute video? You know, which angles, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think ethically, it's always really important to involve the artist in the conversation and to respect their wishes wherever possible. So if an artist tells me, you know, this work will die once, you know, this platform goes down or once the software can no longer be emulated or whatever, then I think we accept that. And it goes against everything that a museum is about, right? We accession works for the future. We don't imagine that we're accessioning things that will die. You know, we're hubristic enough to think that like we're collecting this work for posterity for all time. And the question then becomes, is there any value in paying money to accession a work that will die? And I have made the case that absolutely yes, partly because I believe in supporting living artists and artists need to get paid. And partly because I think that if you have this conversation and you have a plan, right, it's sort of like, you know, planning, like making a last will and testament, right? Like if you plan about what's going to happen, then I still think that you can create sort of value for that object residing in a museum collection moving forward. Sorry, there's a very long-winded answer, but it's something I've thought a lot about. And yeah, unfortunately, as with all time-based media art, there's no one ad hoc solution, right? Like you can't just, you know, every single work needs to get evaluated on its own, which is another reason why this work is so labor intensive. It's sort of easy with the painting. You're like, just like dust it, you know? But with everything, I mean, I'm being somewhat hyperbolic before paintings conservators come at me with knives. But you know, it's so much harder with this stuff.
And I agree completely. And also the conversations with the artist are really important. And another place where the time-based media conservators and the technologists can assist is in proposing ways, ways to manage the hardware, ways to manage the software. Emulation where you kind of make a computer behave like it's running a different, for example, running a different operating system so we can run older pieces. That may not actually work for what the artist wants. It may require that the software be rewritten or things like that. So being able to bring the time-based conservator into the conversation early on is really helpful in understanding what steps might be needed to bring about the types of supports that may be needed in the future.
Those were such great and complimentary questions from both of you. And actually, I kind of want to continue in this realm as well. As you can see in my back, I have an Namjoon Paik poster from Tate Modern back in the day. And as somebody who works on Paik and thinks a lot about Paik's work, a component of work that I also think about is conservation as well. And I have been reading much scholarship that has been done, for example, Hannah Holling's work on Paik's conservation practices that was recently published by University of California Press, which was a really foundational reading for me to start thinking about what happens when an artist passes away and doesn't leave instructions or guides or any step-by-step on how to conserve these works. And this is where conservation practice comes in, and how we think about doing that is such a complex venture. And I think both of you are sort of hinting on these things that are at play when we conserve these works. And I think what's really interesting, like looking at my notes right now, is that both of you are really sort of looking at this interdisciplinary approach to conservation of time-based media art. There's no one person that can do it all. You have to collaborate with so many people on this realm, which is really great. And I kind of want to pose this question to Deena in particular, which is if you could speak a little bit about the aspect of gathering quite literally an international community of time-based media conservators and bringing them together in your edited volume of conservation of time-based media art. What was the trigger for this volume, and how did you go about selecting the contributors?
Oh, thank you. Well, the trigger was a combination of things. People new to the field were looking for a comprehensive volume. Educators, and particularly because I was teaching, educators were requesting it, and it seemed like it was the right time, that the field had matured enough that we could kind of put a stake in the ground and say, this is where we are now. This is what's happening in the field. And it also seemed like the right time to establish the bibliographies. I did a lot of work on the bibliography side. And and the fact that the publisher asked us, so that always helps. Joanna Phillips and I, who I mentioned, she was at the Guggenheim earlier, and now she's the chief conservator for the city of Düsseldorf in Germany. We actually signed the contract for the book just after Thanksgiving of 2019, which means that by early spring, when we were all starting to work on it, we ran into the pandemic. We searched out, after we built the table of contents and decided on the topics, we searched out people in various parts of the world to work with us. But we also decided upfront two decisions that I think speak to your question. One of them is that 3 of the chapters are round table discussions that were then edited for clarity. So we had discussions, one on curatorial practices, one on collaborative practices as done at SF MoMA, and one on artist perspectives, where Joanna and I actually led the roundtable. But in addition to that, we invited all of our chapter authors, and in fact, we did it for the chapters we wrote as well, to interview practitioners around the world. So there were maybe 30, I think, including me and Joanna, there are maybe 32 chapter authors in the book. But when you add in everybody who was interviewed and contributed and cited in the book, that's about 120 or 120 some odd people. And from Asia, South America, Europe, Africa, other Canada, other parts of North America as well. So we felt that by encouraging the chapter authors to interview specialists in their own fields, what happened is that also built some sense of community. It was during the pandemic that this was going on, and it could all be done on Zoom. And we supported the process through grant funding. We supported the process to transcribe the interviews. So, there was all the time change issues. We were in on a number of the interviews. And if it was Europe and California, of course, I was lucky because for me, that was middle of the day, but not for anybody else. And I think that really helped to not only provide the kind of interchange that we really wanted among the chapter authors, but also within the topics themselves. And feedback we got from some of the interviewees as well as chapter authors was that particularly during the pandemic, when people were geographically isolated and in many cases couldn't even get to their institutions, the conversations were going on, and the conversations were crossing national borders and crossing all kinds of borders. So that's, I think, maybe what you were referring to about community and bringing conservators together.
No, it was such a wonderful read. I was so excited when the publication came out, especially because I think it's really interesting how Deena also mentioned reading Pip Lawrence's work. That has also been my foundational reading as well when I started thinking about time-based media. And as I'm sure both of you are aware, like collecting bibliography is such a venture. And I had to do that for my comprehensive exams, which was quite a struggle. And then quite literally I defended, and then your book came out.
Oh.
which was such a sort of, again, cathartic experience for me to see that come to fruition. And it's such like a sort of, I see it as a manual book in a way as well.
Yeah.
And thinking about larger conversations at play for me is this idea of museums and curators and the roles that curators had and continue to have in regard to sort of being the stewards of time-based media art in museums, which leads me to my question to Deena, who is one of the leading scholars who works to reconstruct the early history of new media art. So I'm thinking, how did your thinking develop from your dissertation on how light became the medium that we associate with new media art today?
Right. Okay. So, so I was writing this dissertation on the emergence of media art in the 60s and really focusing specifically on light art. So artists working with, primarily with electric light, with neon, with, with fluorescent bulbs, with incandescent lights, with strobe lights, and not so much with there were also artists working with like sunlight and fire, but really I was focused on the electric and electronic work. And so necessarily I had to start thinking about questions of conservation because frankly, as somebody who was trained in part as a formalist and who always thought that our interpretation of artwork should be grounded on a close reading of the aesthetic object, I found myself in the position of being fascinated by this field of light art and wanting desperately to write about it and having no objects to look at. That essentially I was writing a historiography. I was writing about the articles that were about light art from the 60s. I was writing about the discourse and how light art was talked about and how it was positioned and understood relative to other kinds of practices like early video art and early computer art and the history of kineticism from the 20s. But I mean, very rarely in my dissertation, for somebody who identifies very profoundly as a formalist and who then wound up having a career as a curator and working closely with objects, it's very strange to look back at my dissertation and realize how little I was able to do close readings of specific works just because they no longer exist and because there's such a paucity of documentation. So when you do have a photo of the work, it might be a black and white image that was in an art magazine from the 60s that's about this big, and that's it. And for a, colorful kinetic light sculpture, that tells you almost nothing. So, so it, I think working with, so I guess my entry point into this question was really through the sculptural and the mechanical. And now I've become more, aware and invested in the conversation around digital objects, but they are sort of very different fields. Even just from a, on a technical level, they require very different competencies. And I was just having this conversation today. This is a really wonderful day to be having this talk because clearly it's in the air because I keep on thinking about it. But I was just having this conversation today and explaining that, the field of time-based media art conservation, that it's so specific and it's so important. And in a sense, because it requires active conservation, it's kind of more urgent. And that, we really need to be relying on experts. And I'm so grateful that there are programs now that are training those people. And all the time I get asked, like, what field should I want to work in the arts. What should I do? And I say, well, if you have any head for science, please, please, please consider time-based media art conservation. Because I think in about 20 years, everyone, not even, it's already happening, but I think really in 20 years, every museum is going to be like, and so anybody who can, come out with some expertise, experience, degrees, whatever it is, any training will get ahead of it. Look, I'm not sure if that answered your question in an interesting way. I feel like maybe you were trying to get at something that just wasn't about my own personal epiphany and journey, but I'm sorry if there's probably something more profound there, but it's almost 5 o'clock.
No, Deena, I first want to say I have really read in such thorough depth your dissertation, and it's kind of a shame to hear you say that you didn't look closely, which I actually completely disagree. I think you have done such an excellent job in looking closely and disclosing this really important history about fluidity between art and technology that was happening in 1960s, 70s, in particular the Howard Wise Gallery, which is really interesting because the most artists that are working with time-based media art at the time are going through that gallery and are having really foundational exhibitions that have shaped the history of time-based media art, video art in particular as well, which is something that I have a special focus on. So I want to note that, and the answer was very, very, very great. And your dissertation was part of my bibliography and continues to be very much so part of my thinking on time-based media art. So I'm just going to say that. But I also want to build on the conversations that both of you are sort of hinting about this idea of documentation. And Deena, I think you're spot on with the comment that museums will need, if they need it now as well, conservators of time-based media art. And actually, I have been noticing that the job postings are happening everywhere right now in museums. Actually, I just noticed recently that the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi is searching for a time-based media conservator, which is really interesting to think about this larger implications of time-based media art, the necessities to be conserved more internationally, because as the scholarship has sort of focused on it, it seems that the United States and Europe are sort of the centers of conservation of time-based media art when it comes to programs and educational institutions that have those programs. But the need is much broader, and we're slowly seeing that need being articulated across the world as well. Which leads me to my final question for the day. Which is, if we're thinking about museums that are working in this space, I wonder whether any particular innovative or novel approaches stood out to you both as worth recognizing in our discussion today.
Well, in my experience, it's really around the research. As you say, documentation, going about developing the documentation templates, figuring out how to document, because of the interdisciplinary nature of this field, which does give it such a digital humanities paradigm in its own way. I feel that the museums that I've collaborated with, who really understand that, as we've said, and as Tina said so well, there is no one size that fits all across time-based media generally, and from artwork to artwork. So the research is important. And, of course, my bias is that since I came to this field from academia, I was part of museum academic collaborations to make this happen. And I hope that over time, museum galleries especially will be able to find people in the computer science or the software engineering or other departments who really want to work in cultural heritage and who will collaborate across these divides to be able to provide what's happening. But it's a great deal of research, finding ways to store the research, whether it's a GitHub account or finding other, working with IT. This hasn't come up yet, but collaboration with institutions' IT departments can be a huge help in organizing, not only in how digital artworks and digital files are stored, but also the documentation for the artworks, and that needs to be collected, and the research that is collected, whether it's spreadsheets and tables and whatever.
Great. Deena, would you like to answer this question as well?
No, I think that was great. I don't know if I have really anything to add to that.
Perfect. Well, as we're coming to an end of the event, I'm going to ask if any of you have closing thoughts or observations.
Well, from my point of view, which is that, when I was at Sotheby's and I was the only person in the IT department who could even talk to the art experts, let alone I won a number of bets about, people, we would all try to guess who the particular artist was or whatever. And after I won a number of bets, I did get respect from the art experts as well because of my love of art and knowledge of art. But I just think this is such an exciting field, and it will be constantly changing. It'll continue to grow. The artists are going to push the envelope. That's their job. The technologists are going to be pushing the envelope, but not really necessarily caring what came first. And I believe very strongly that conserving cultural heritage is so important socially and on so many levels. And this is an important part of it. This is the age we live in. Digital objects are very important.
Great. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Deena, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say to sort of put a finer point on that. I mean, I always I'm a historian at heart, like I'm an archive junkie. I was a historian before I was a critic, before I was a curator. And so I care very much about preserving the history. I just value the past inherently because it is the past, which is maybe a personal failing. I don't know. But anyway, I want to conserve art. It's really important to me. But every now and then I zoom out and think about the much larger crisis, in a sense, which is actually that all digital culture is so vulnerable. I mean, I think this is what Deena was saying. I think, as an elder millennial and, first generation digital native, basically, the amount of my own personal history, right, that is lost to the sands of time, the number of times I have migrated email accounts and not sufficiently, appropriately archived them, the number of, cloud storage services that I, no longer have access to. And I'll even go back all the way to like MySpace and Friendster and like all of these networks that I've been a part of that now I have absolutely no record of. And as a historian, who has learned a lot by like reading, typed manuscripts and letters, exchanged between artists and museum directors, et cetera, what kind of trail are we leaving behind? Our civilization, such as it existed for the past 30 years is basically, I know we think digital is forever, but it's not, as we all know. And not only that, but we're also, because of the volume of it, right? Unless we create a way to sort of siphon through that, like unless we create an architecture to allow us to make sense of it, it's like the problem's two-sided. Either like the files won't be there, or we won't be able to see, we won't actually be able to make our way through it. It'll just be too much. And so it's just such a huge problem. And I'm really glad that there's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am who are currently working on it. But it's just made me think a lot, like as I'm, like transitioning between jobs right now, like it's made me think a lot about my own personal archive practices and, how I manage my own, digital archives and what I'm going to leave to my kid and, that kind of thing, like what kind of records. So, yeah. It's a big problem that like touches all of us in really profound ways. And then, gets caught up in larger conversations about like, how do we know what history is? And like, how do we adjudicate claims to truth when like, we don't have evidence or, so anyway, like This is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night.
That was such a fabulous way to close it, Tina, as well. I want to thank both of you for all the great work you have done so far and for all the great work you're going to do in the future. You are truly shaping the field of time-based media art, and somebody who studies that, and that is my subfield. I want to thank both of you for your incredible contributions. I also want to thank our attendees who have listened to us today and who came to our event. And I want to make a little note that this was recorded and will be posted on our website in the future, so you can go back and listen to all the great things that our speakers have said today. Again, thank you all, and I hope you enjoy your weekend.